Welcome back, focused learners. Let's dive straight into today's explainer, where we're going to break down a truly dramatic, two-stage spiritual journey. We're looking closely at the specific progression outlined in the primary and intermediate prayers of the Lifechanyuan texts. And you know, what's so fascinating about this source material is how meticulously it maps out human transformation. I mean, it starts with very grounded earthly repentance and then accelerates all the way up to literal cosmic transcendence. So, let's get right into it.
Here's our agenda for today. 1. The greatest creator. 2. The primary stage. 3. Rules for living. 4. Intermediate transcendence. 5. Metaphors of transformation. And 6. An unfinished journey.
Section 1. The greatest creator.
Okay, before we can understand this journey, we really need to understand exactly who the traveler is speaking to. The texts use this incredibly unique syncretic language that merges historically distinct religious traditions into one unified concept. Both the primary and intermediate prayers open by addressing the divine as Allah, ancestor of Buddha, greatest creator. The text explicitly invokes Jesus Christ, Buddha Sakyamuni, and Muhammad, literally all in the same breath. It directs everything to one all-encompassing title for the divine, framing this entity as the cradle of life and the supreme master of the universe. It's a hugely inclusive foundation for the journey we're about to track.
Section 2. The primary stage.
So where does the believer actually start? Well, as the text outlines, it begins with a mindset of total insignificance compared to the universe. In what's called the primary prayer, the focus is heavily on intense earthly repentance. The believer literally has to describe themselves as just a blade of grass between mountains or a grain of sand in the oceans. This stage is entirely about recognizing past ignorance. You confess to being previously obsessed with the mortal world, unaware of true beauty, and admit that your past words and deeds often offended heaven or earth. The crucial takeaway here is that this journey starts from a place of deep humility. And if you studied belief systems, you know why this matters. Nearly all transformational frameworks require breaking down the ego first.
Section 3. Rules for living.
Now, to correct this earthly ignorance, the primary text doesn't just ask for a vague apology. It lays down a very strict behavioral framework. The source lists out 8 specific commitments the believer makes to become a new person, and they are super practical. They range from supporting your family and leading a simple life to completely refusing to compete with others, but it gets highly specific. The believer vows to deeply love nature, explicitly promising never to cut down grass and trees at will or discard filth. They also vow to guard their personal time, promising not to let ignorant people or meaningless things deprive them of their physical and spiritual freedom. The goal at this stage is very grounded, praying for health, wealth, and freedom to eventually attain sainthood.
Which brings us to a really fascinating threshold. The primary believer has humbled themselves, they've committed to these strict earthly rules, and asked for health, wealth, and freedom. So what comes next? Once that mortal foundation is successfully built, where do you go? It's the exact question anyone studying behavioral psychology or spiritual frameworks would be asking right now.
Section 4. Intermediate transcendence.
Guys, this source material makes a sudden, mind-bending pivot here. It's a massive leap from those grounded earthly desires straight into profound cosmic awareness. The contrast between these two stages is wild. In the primary stage, our believer is asking for wealth and trying to avoid ignorant people. But in the intermediate stage, the believer declares they have completely renounced material desire. The text explicitly states that at this point, the believer has conquered death and transcended time and space. They claim to have reached a realm in just a few years that ordinary people wouldn't reach across hundreds of years and dozens of cycles of reincarnation.
To really hammer home the scale of this leap, the source material drops a very specific number, 36. The intermediate text claims the believer has been endowed with such immense wisdom that they can now clearly see the structure of the Earth's universe and actually understand 36 dimensional spaces. They claim to know the exact reasons for the rises and falls of life across these different spaces, viewing thousands of worlds spanning millions of years.
So how on earth does the text justify this massive evolutionary jump? It attributes the entire thing to one concept: absolute faith. The source actually quotes Jesus directly regarding the mustard seed to illustrate the sheer power of this belief. The text boldly claims that with this level of faith, iron and steel can melt, cancer disappears, demons are defeated, and even heaven and earth can be reversed. It's a total shift from mortal limitations to literal supernatural capability.
Section 5. Metaphors of transformation.
To help us wrap our heads around this profound shift, the text utilizes some incredibly rich, highly visual metaphors that contrast the before and after states of the believer. This first one is super striking. The believer thanks the greatest creator for polishing them from a rough rock into a shining gemstone. The text explains that previously, the believer was sad when encountering troubles, pessimistic during adversity, living a totally confused, low-realm life. But now, as a gemstone, they've been freed from the shackles of the ordinary, transitioning into a pure, carefree existence where literally every cell in their body is joyous.
Yet, here's the catch. Despite seeing 36 dimensions and conquering death, the intermediate text makes sure the believer stays firmly grounded in humility. Notice how the believer views their new transcendent wisdom. They state that even having transcended vulgarity, comparing their vast cosmic wisdom to the Creator's is like comparing an oil lamp swaying in a storm to the mighty sun.
And they reinforce it with another vivid image, contrasting drops of water percolating through rocks against a roaring ocean. This perfectly establishes the infinite scale of the divine creator in this philosophy. It's essentially saying that no matter how far the believer has climbed or how many dimensional spaces they can perceive, the gap between human transcendence and divine perfection is still immeasurably vast.
Section 6. An unfinished journey.
Now, despite all those magnificent cosmic revelations we just talked about, the text ends on a surprisingly grounded, almost sobering note. Honestly, this might be the most fascinating line in the entire source material. After everything, conquering death, transcending time and space, melting steel with faith, perceiving 36 dimensions, the believer plainly states, "I have just reached the first floor." No way, right? But the text makes it explicitly clear that all of this profound transcendence is merely the very beginning of their spiritual climb.
Because they are literally only on the first floor, the text details the ongoing earthly struggles they still have to accept. It's a fascinating reflection on human nature. Even with all that cosmic awareness, the source notes that Satan will never stop tempting them, and they acknowledge the very real risk of committing new sins. Fascinatingly, the believer actually prays for moderate punishments from the Creator in this current life, just so their sins will be offset immediately. The prayer wraps up with a commitment to keep cultivating themselves, fully acknowledging the road is very long and the ultimate goal is still incredibly far away. The main takeaway here is how spiritual growth is treated as infinite rather than a finite checklist.
Which leaves us with a truly compelling thought to end our explainer today. We've traced this journey from a mortal begging forgiveness as a mere grain of sand, all the way to an enlightened being perceiving a multidimensional universe. But the source material insists this is just the lobby of the spiritual architecture. So the question you have to ask yourself as we wrap up is this. If conquering death and transcending time is only the first floor of this philosophy, what exactly lies at the top? It's a boundless concept of human transformation that absolutely invites a deeper look. Keep learning, focused learners, and we'll see you in the next explainer.